had a very busy summer, haven't we? A lot of things going on. I'm so excited that we spent some time studying movies. We looked at movies in the beginning part of the summer. A lot of you have said how much fun you had being able to look at movies you've seen in a whole different light. I absolutely love movies. There's two things about movies that really draw me to them and that tell me how special movies can be. And the first is that movies bring people together. We usually grab a friend or a family member or a whole crew of our girlfriends or boyfriends and we head down to the movies and we watch. And then the second thing about movies that I really like is that there's a story that's told in the movies. And it never fails when we go to movies, whether we like them or not, the very first thing we do is we try and share the story. We tell people, oh, I went to see a movie and this was the story. And a lot of us who haven't even seen the movie now know the story behind Star Wars and all those great movies that are out there. We kind of know the plot line. We know the story because people share it. And that's like the Bible. Scripture brings people together, and then we find that there are stories contained in Scripture, great stories of people, and then we get to share those stories with others. We get to say, hey, I heard a story in the Bible about such and such, about so and so. And the more that we open Scripture, we find that the Scripture really isn't this kind of dull, boring kind of book. I mean, there are stories in there of battles. There are stories of deep romance. There's some adult-only stories in that Bible. Some things we don't necessarily open on a Sunday morning. There's a lot of stories in that Bible. So this morning we're going to jump into a story. We're going to dive right into the deep end of a story that's told throughout the Old Testament, particularly through the books of Exodus and Numbers, and then in Joshua. And it's a story that begins, really, the main line of this story is it's a leadership transfer. It's leadership between a guy by the name of Moses. Have you heard of Moses? Some of you have probably seen the movie, right? And another guy by the name of Joshua. Now, Joshua doesn't have his own movie yet. But Joshua is the superhero of this story. And you see, this story begins way back when Moses is leading the people, and he's doing exactly what God has commanded him to do. And he goes to Pharaoh, and he pleads with Pharaoh. And you kind of know the story about all the different things that he does to Pharaoh to try and get him to let his people go. And so finally Pharaoh agrees, and he lets the people go, and Moses leads the people of Israel. They're called Israelites, and they're the people of God. And so Moses leads them out into the wilderness and into the darkness. But Moses feels he's leading them to freedom. Freedom away from slavery and oppression and all the horrible things that were happening to them in Egypt. And so out they go, and God keeps telling Moses, you are leading the people to my promised land. Promised land. A land that God has promised to the people. And so as Moses does, they come up to the edge of this promised land. They're right up there to the edge, and they're looking into this vast country. And so they decide they're going to send 12 spies into the land to see what it's like before they go. Now, the 12 spies are representative of the 12 tribes of the people of Israel. And so the 12 spies, they go out, and they're gone for days and weeks at a time. And two of them happen to be a man by the name of Joshua and his best buddy, Caleb. And then there's 10 others. And the story tells us that after the time that they're out there exploring the land to see what's in the promised land, they come back and they give what we call a report. Now the 10 come back and they're scared. I mean, they come running up to camp and they're out of breath and they say, you won't believe this. This is a horrible place. There are giants living in the land. We were just like grasshoppers to them. They easily could have just stepped on us. It's scary out there. We'll never be able to defeat them. We are too small and too weak. There's no way I will tell you to go into that promised land. And so the crowds around, they hear these horrible things and they start to fill themselves with fear because, of course, the people saw. And so they start to say, well, I'm not going. I don't want to be stepped on. What in the world are you doing to us, Moses? Why did you lead us all the way up here only to be stepped on by these giants? I'm not going. And the murmuring and the grumbling and the retreat begins to happen. And Moses is trying to tell them, but God has spoken. This is the land called what? Promised land. People aren't listening, and so now comes the last two spies, Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua and Caleb say, no, this is the land just exactly like God told us it would be. It's filled with milk and honey. It is beautiful and lush. We're good. We know that once we enter into this land, God will provide the strength that we need. God has told us that if we follow him, he will protect us. We can defeat them. We can step on them, said Joshua. We can do this. But this is what often happens in human history, isn't it? We don't listen to those people. We listen to those who fill our hearts with fear, our minds with doubt. We begin to struggle with, God said that, but maybe that wasn't what he meant. Did you ever hear that one? Or when we're going through the toughest times in our life, somebody says, God has a purpose. Those aren't God's words. Those are our words trying to take over control for God, who we simply cannot know all about. And Joshua and Caleb, they're trying so hard to convince these people, no, God has said he will provide for us. And God said he would do this and that. And God said it is what kind of land? Promised land. And God does not fall back on his promises. But the other 10 spies were just like, oh, no, it's horrible. We do not want to be there. And so the crowd turned. Literally. Yes, they turned on Moses and they started to grumble and they started to say, why did you bring us here? But they literally did an about face and said, we want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to the way things were. Because that's the way we've always done it. That's one of the things that I don't allow our leadership team to say here at Lifegate. Oh, but that's the way we've always done it. Right, Kurt? They wanted to go back what they knew, even though what they knew was what? Oppression, depression, demise, decline, hunger, famine. But they knew that. So they wanted to turn around and go back to what they knew. But Joshua and Caleb are saying, no, we need to move forward. We need to go into God's land. God's what kind of land? Promised land. Because God has a plan. We need to trust in God. We need to know that God has a plan and it's already there. But so many people who were listening to the doubters, they turned and they said, you know what? It's either my way or it's the highway. I want this, this, and this. I want my life to look like this, this, and this. I want all of these creature comforts here, here, and here. I want my kind of music. I want to sit in my kind of pew. I want to have my kind of time, and I want it on my schedule. Or I'm out of here. And God, in his ultimate wisdom and a little bit of humor, says, fine. There's the highway. And they went on the highway. 40 years. 40 years those people wandered in circles in the wilderness, not being allowed to get into the promised land. 40 years it took for every single naysayer and every single doubter to finally die off. And when they were all gone, Joshua then steps up. And that's the point of the story that we get here with Joshua. What I'm calling our superhero for today. And Joshua, I want to repeat some of the words that you heard in the scriptures read for you this morning. Joshua says, no one shall be able to stand against you. He didn't say almost no one. He said no one. He said, as it was with Moses, so God will go with us. I will not fail you or forsake you. He said, be strong. Be courageous, for you shall put people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors. Because what kind of land did God call it? Promised. And God doesn't go back on his promises. And so Joshua hung on to God's promises and he looked forward with hope. He always looked forward with hope. It's the very first principle of being descendants of Joshua. Did you know you were a descendant of Joshua? Did you know somewhere in your family line you can say, oh, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy was filled with hope. Hope. Hope because he trusted in the words of God. Joshua people, you and I always look forward to hope. You know, I've only been here 3 years, but a lot of things have changed. I'm sure he meant that nicely. A lot of things have changed. And people have said to me, you know, this isn't how it used to be. We've always been Summers Point United Methodist Church. We've always had blue walls in our church. We've always done this. We've always done that. We've always programmed these things. We've always done it this way. And you know, I did a little research when I first came, and I began to be really just encouraged and enlightened as to what the congregation of this church have done. And the history. And the changes that we sometimes forget about. You know, this church actually dates all the way back to 1892. Someone once told me, no, we started in 1980. No, you didn't. All the way back in 1892, we began with Friday night class meetings of people who gathered together in people's homes all around the region. And they moved from home to home to home to home until finally in 1902, someone opened up a catalog book called a Sears and Roebuck. Anybody remember that? And you could buy a building right out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And they did. They bought the whole building, had it shipped here, they built it on Shore Road, and that's where they started to meet. I sometimes think we never should have built a building because then we transferred church from the people to the structure. Church is you, not this building. But in 1902, they started to meet in a building, and they started to gather together and give praise and worship. And then finally, they created a name for themselves. They were called Bethany. And they were called Bethany Methodist. And in 1949, all the way up to 1982, they had another home that they stayed at. And every time they moved, and every time they built, and every time they did these things was to reach out into the community, to invite more people in, to make it easier. In fact, there was a second church that has our history to it. It was called Mariners Church. And that was formed in 1848, right here in our region. And the whole reason Mariners Church was created was because Central Church was too far for the fishermen in Summers Point to travel to. So a man created a little bit of plot of land, and he built a building, and he called it Mariners Church. So that the fishermen in our region didn't have to go all the way to Central Church, they could meet right here. And they began to meet, and they began to grow, and they began to invite others in. And then Mariners Church joined with something strange called the Methodist Church. And they joined with churches all around our region. They joined with Central, Zion, Asbury, and Bethany. All 5 churches became part of one circuit. They had one pastor who rode around on horseback. I'm so glad I don't have to drive around on horseback. At least I get to drive from here to there. And it wasn't until much later then after the Methodist Church joined with United Brethren that we became United Methodist Church. And we changed the name again. All in an effort to reach out into the community and bring people in. This is a rich, rich history. So many things have happened. And then finally, Bethel and Bethany decided to join together to create an even stronger church, to create an even bigger presence in the community. And those two, what we might call little churches, built a 15,000 square foot building, and you're sitting in it. And today this church houses AA relief, NA recovery. It's a place where little boys come together in scouting programs and learn how to be productive and good, faithful community citizens. It's where we gather together to give worship and praise. It's where people come who have no clothing and little money, and they go into our thrift store, and not only do they get a piece of clothing and a warm hug, they get prayed on. We have people who come to our thrift store who don't even shop. They come for fellowship. They come for prayer. I've heard people come in the door some days, they'll come in and they'll say, hey, Heather, hey, Debbie, guess what's going on in my life? Or they'll walk in the door and they'll say, I need prayer. Every time this congregation has stepped out, it's stepped out to reach the community. It's stepped out to serve. And 2.5 years ago, when we decided to change our name to Lifegate, to open up our doors, we did the same thing. We're representing that Jesus is the Lifegate. And that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And we did it so that we could reach out into the community, invite more people in. That is what moves me about this congregation. That's what moves me about you being the church. That's what they've called us to do. Our connection goes all the way back to 1848. Joshua people, look forward with hope. We trust in God. We don't know what's on the other side. We don't know what promised land looks like. But we know God has already gone there, and he's calling us there. And whatever the mountain is we have to climb, he will give us the strength to do it. Whatever he is called, as long as we honor him. Joshua people do not turn tail and retreat. We do not go back to the way things were just because we know the way they were. Because you know what? They're never going to be like that again. Ever. I met a previous pastor to this church this weekend. He was on vacation and he stopped in just to see what was going on. And in my heart, I was praying that the people here were filling him with great tales of all the excitement that was happening. And my fear was that there were some people who were wishing they were back in Egypt. Who were saying, yeah, we changed the name, but it really doesn't mean anything. Yeah, the walls aren't blue anymore, but it really doesn't mean anything. I really wish we were back the way it used to be when we used to have to set up folding chairs on Easter. Those times are not in the future. And you know that, and I know that. People of church today don't necessarily sit in pews on Sunday morning. But they're called by God to do good things in the world and to be of service. And they want to follow Jesus. But they want to know about Jesus. That's what we're called to do. To introduce them to the life gate of the world. To reach more people. And to always look forward with hope. I believe this is the same thing that drives us to do the crazy things that we do. And we do some pretty crazy things here. We marched in a parade. Whoever thought a church would march in a parade? But we donned on our green t-shirts and we decorated a float and we went out there and we marched on Memorial Day parade. We marched in the Christmas parade. We handed out pens of all things. And that name is just getting out into the community. As a fellowship who loves one another, who comes together and supports one another, who grows together and reaches out and serves. It's the same thing that calls us to do all the decisions that our leadership team is making. Now I know some of you know someone who has left the church. I know some of you know someone who doesn't speak well of our church. And I want to remind you that those people are the people in Egypt. They're looking backwards. And we can love on them, and we can pray for them. But just like Joshua, we need to move to the promised land. We need to move forward. We need to go where God already has planned a place for us. And we need to move forward with hope and trust in God. Because what kind of a land did God already place in front of us? Promised land. And that's the land we're called to. God never told the people of Joshua, turn around. Not once. Not once did he ever tell them to do that. You know, this past weekend I mentioned to you that 1,871 people came here. When was the last time you planted 1,871 people on this property? But it wasn't what we were thinking, was it? We were all thinking, oh, we got to set up folding chairs so they'll come in here and sit. So that they'll put cash or check in the plate. God said, no, that's not what I've got in mind. This community is going to reach out to the whole community. And this community is going to invite 1,871 people in. And this community is going to reach out and expose people to the children of the world, my world. The children who are hurting and suffering. And before you know it, we're going to celebrate 81 children who have sponsors. People who are going to lift them up out of the muck that they're in, the poverty that they're in, give them food and clothing and shelter and an education. That is God's promised land. And that is what we can be so excited and energized by. And we can continue to reach forward out into the world. Continue to look forward with hope. Now, I know hope is tough. I know it's hard. I know there are times when it just seems like things are way too dark. I know there are times that we sit around our leadership team and we think we just don't have the funds to do this. We don't have the volunteers to do this. We're getting tired. And then all of a sudden something steps up and someone steps out. And we act like we're amazed. And I think that's how God works. That is exactly how God works. And we continue to move forward in hope. And we do it with the same spirit and the trust that Joshua had. Tomorrow, we don't simply know what's going to happen, do we? And for some of us, we're saying, I don't even know how I'm going to get to tomorrow. Neither did Joshua. Joshua didn't know what these giants were going to do. He didn't know what milk and honey looked like. But he trusted in God's promise. And he moved forward. And he led the people that way. Joshua was a superhero of his day. And he's still a superhero today. You know, speaking of superheroes, I got to tell you, I have one favorite. He's a relative of mine. His name's Tony Stark. I always get that question everywhere I go. So I just want to tell you today, yes, he's my relative. But in the Iron Man movie, there's a quote that Iron Man says, and I love this quote. It says, "Heroes are made by the path they choose, not by the powers they are graced with." I've heard it said that God doesn't choose those who are already graced. He chooses and then he graces. God doesn't choose people who are already able. He chooses you and then he makes you able. Heroes are made by the path they choose, not because of the powers they are graced with. And so which do you choose? Do you choose the path of doubt and fear and despair? Do you look backwards because it seems to be more comfortable, because at least you know how horrible it will be? Or do you look forward with hope? Do you choose the path of faith and trust? Which direction is God calling you? And I hope you'll choose the Joshua way. Amen.